Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Ragamuffin photo challenge. It's all about controlling your camera. I am going to jump straight into our lesson today because we have a lot to cover, but don't worry, I've broken down the fundamentals of controlling your camera into some really easy beginner steps to photography. So first up, let's start at the start. What is exposure? You've probably heard photographers and people talk about exposure before, and essentially it's just referring to the amount of light in a photo. So when a photo is what we call underexposed, it's essentially too dark. It might look something like this. When a photo is overexposed, it's too bright. There's too much light that has entered the camera, and again, we can't really make out the details of the image. Somewhere in between, we have a correctly or well exposed photo. And this is where we have details in both the highlights and the shadows. Now, there are loads of ways that you can measure this, histograms, light meters. I'm not going to get into that for the 5-day challenge. Again, if you are interested in learning more about any of this, definitely check out my 6-week ultimate course because I think you'll enjoy that. But today we're just going to stick with the real basics. The 3 elements of exposure. Those 3 elements are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. All 3 of these elements come into play every single time you take a photo. First up, we've got ISO, which measures your camera's sensitivity to light. Essentially, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive your camera is and the brighter the image will appear. We're not going to chat any more about ISO for the sake of this 5-day challenge, so just keep your ISO on auto. And then we have shutter speed, which measures the amount of time that your camera shutter is open and letting light into the camera. A very fast shutter speed might sound something like this, whereas you can slow that shutter speed down, thereby letting in a lot more light, and it might sound something more like this. So basically, like opening a door or a window, suddenly you will be letting in lots of light. You're exposing the camera to that light and that information and then closing it down again. Obviously, the longer you leave those doors open, the more light is going to flood onto the camera. So a slower shutter speed results in a brighter looking image, and a faster shutter speed results in a darker image. However, there's another important aspect to shutter speed. You can also use it to control the motion blur. So a fast shutter speed will freeze action. It's what sports photographers use. It's what pet photographers use for those photos of dogs running through the frame. And it's what I recommend you use if you want to photograph your pet in action. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So the smaller the fraction, the faster the shutter speed. In this example, which I've taken of Lyra running in our backyard, at a 60th of a second, there is a lot of what we call motion blur. That's because the shutter speed was open for too long, so she was moving while the shutter was open. When I raise it up to a 2000th of a second, now we're closer to freezing that action. Action photography is really difficult. I have lots of other tips and tricks for action pet photography if you're interested in that. But just as a starter point, remember that a higher shutter speed is absolutely essential if you want to freeze that action. Aperture refers to the amount of light that is being let in through the lens every time that shutter is open. Your lens is made up of lots of different parts, but the aperture can be adjusted to let in more or less light through this hole. So you should think of the aperture like your camera's pupil. When it's really dark, your pupils get bigger so that they can let more light into your brain so you can process the information around you. It's similar with photography. If it's darker, we want to let more light into the camera, so we want a wider aperture. Just like shutter speed, there is another element to aperture. Not only does it let in more or less light, it also affects the depth of field to your image. So this is essentially referring to that background blur. In modern photography, it's considered quite aesthetically pleasing to have a lot of background blur, so many photographers choose to shoot at wider apertures. It's a great way to really focus in on the subject that you're photographing without having any distractions in the background. Aperture is measured as f-stop, so you'll see these little f/numbers. The smaller the number, the wider the aperture. Well, I've taken this first photo on f/16. You can see a lot of the detail in the background. You can see the neighbor's house, you can see all the grass, you can see the fence. It's quite a busy, distracting portrait of Lyra. This next photo is taken on f/2.8. I've kept everything else the same, the background, the same lens, with similar exposure. We've just changed the aperture. And as you can see, there's a lot more background blur, and it really lets us focus in on Lyra as the subject of the photograph. Just a quick tip before we move on, you may or may not have noticed so far that in the lessons there may be a little phone icon or a little camera icon. That's a quick way to tell you whether or not the tip that I'm currently instructing you on is for smartphones or for cameras. So how do we go about actually adjusting these three elements of exposure? Well, for starters, let me give you a little tip for how you can adjust the brightness in your smartphone images. All you need to do is tap on wherever you want to focus, and you'll see there comes that little sunshine icon. If you raise your finger up, it will get brighter, and down it will get darker. There are three types of shooting modes for mirrorless and DSLR cameras. We've got the automatic shooting modes, the semi-automatic shooting modes, and the manual shooting modes. So automatic is when your camera decides all those elements of exposure for you, fine for snapshots, but a lot of the time it does get that exposure incorrect, and it doesn't allow you to take any sort of creative control over your photography. Manual is when you personally choose all of the different elements of exposure. So you're choosing the ISO, you're choosing the shutter speed, and you're choosing the aperture to create the image that you want. Semi-automatic modes are what I'm going to teach you about today. So we've got two main types of semi-automatic modes. We've got shutter speed priority and we've got aperture priority. Basically, with semi-automatic mode, you get to choose one of the elements of exposure and the camera will choose the other two elements to best create a well-exposed photo. So this gives you a lot more control over how your final image looks. If you're shooting your pet moving through the frame, you might want to choose shutter speed priority. If you're wanting to create a beautiful portrait with a lot of depth, you're going to want to choose aperture priority. If you're shooting action photos on your smartphone, I recommend activating the burst mode. To do this, all you need to do is tap the screen wherever you want to focus, and then you hold down the camera button. So this is taking lots of photos at once. You can then go into your screen, whichever photo that you want to pick from. If you're photographing your moving pet on a camera, we're going to set your shooting mode to shutter speed priority. So this might be marked as TV, which stands for time value, or S. Next, you need to set your shutter speed, which I recommend you setting at least 1/1500th of a second, especially if your pet is moving quite quickly through the frame. The quicker the shutter speed, the more the action is going to be frozen. So if you can go higher, by all means do that. Now, because that's a really quick shutter speed, not a lot of light is going to be let into the frame. So avoid doing these sorts of action shots late in the day or really early in the morning. You want more light. You want it to be on a nice bright day. Many smartphones now have an option to select a portrait mode, which recreates the effect of having a shallow depth of field with a wide aperture. Now, it is a digital recreation, so it's not as pretty as the real thing, in my personal opinion. But if you're shooting on a smartphone, it is a fun way to dip your toe into using aperture. So all you need to do is open up your camera and select the portrait mode. Go ahead and select the widest aperture possible, which is going to be the smaller f number, so f2.8 for example, and you'll see that there will be a lot of background blur. One of the cool things about this digital effect is that you can actually adjust it after the fact, which you cannot do with traditional photography. So you can take your photo and then decide, ooh, that was a little bit too much blur, and reel it back a little, or add some more blur if you fancy. On your camera, select aperture priority or AV shooting mode, and then select your f-stop or your aperture. You want to select the widest f-stop possible to create the maximum depth for this exercise. You can also zoom in a little bit more with your lens or move closer to your pet to create even more depth. A quick note on lenses and apertures just before we wrap everything up. So you can tell what the maximum aperture of your specific lens is just by having a look on the lens itself. So you'll see a little number somewhere that says after the focal length, which is the millimeters, that says 1 to 2.8 in this case. So this is a f2.8 lens. That means the widest aperture that this lens can go to is 2.8. So all different lenses have all different widest apertures. Now there are two different categories of apertures when it comes to lenses. So you have the fixed aperture lens or the variable aperture lens. And kit lenses, which are those cheaper beginner lenses that often come with cameras, typically have a variable aperture. What that means is that the maximum aperture your lens can go to will change depending on your focal length. So depending on whether or not you're really zoomed in or you're really zoomed out. A fixed aperture lens has the same maximum aperture regardless of the focal length. Today's assignment is camera control, and I want you to decide between shutter speed or aperture for your photography today. So basically you're going to be deciding whether or not you want to showcase your pet moving through the frame with an action photograph, or if you want to create a portrait with a lot of depth. By all means, play around with both, but for the sake of the assignment, just submit one or the other. So take your photo in either shutter speed priority or aperture priority, or if you're photographing on a smartphone, that'll be burst mode or portrait mode. If you pick shutter speed, then I want to see an example of your pet frozen in action and moving through the frame. If you picked aperture, then I want to see depth in the photo. I want to see that background blur as much as possible. Once you've taken your photo, post it to the challenge and then pick someone else's photo to leave some positive feedback. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!